Breaking news out of Washington. A major gun control law has just been struck down, and now the battle is heading straight to the Supreme Court of the United States. A federal court has ruled that a controversial high-capacity magazine ban violates the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, sending shockwaves through the legal and political world. But the story doesn't stop there. The controversy centers on laws that prohibit the sale, possession, or manufacture of so-called large-capacity or high-capacity firearm magazines. In most of these laws, a large-capacity magazine is defined as one capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition. Legislators who supported these bans argued that limiting magazine capacity could reduce the potential harm during violent incidents, particularly mass shootings. Their reasoning was that if a firearm holds fewer rounds, a shooter would need to reload more frequently, potentially creating opportunities for victims to escape or for law enforcement to intervene. However, opponents of these restrictions argued that the bans go too far and infringe on the constitutional right to keep and bear arms. They pointed out that magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds are extremely common and have been widely owned by Americans for decades. Because millions of these magazines are already in circulation and are frequently included as standard equipment with many modern firearms, critics argued that banning them effectively restricts access to equipment that is considered ordinary and commonly used for lawful purposes such as self-defense, target shooting, and recreational firearm use. This disagreement ultimately led to a legal challenge in federal court. Individuals, firearm owners, and advocacy groups filed lawsuits claiming the ban violated the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, which protects the right of individuals to keep and bear arms. They argued that if a firearm accessory is widely owned and commonly used for lawful purposes, it should fall under constitutional protection. After reviewing the arguments and the evidence presented by both sides, a federal judge concluded that the government had not sufficiently justified restricting these magazines under current constitutional standards. The court therefore ruled that the ban could not remain in effect, determining that it conflicted with protections guaranteed by the President's Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. This decision immediately triggered intense legal and political debate and set the stage for further appeals and possible review by the Supreme Court of the United States. The court's decision was heavily influenced by recent constitutional guidance from the Supreme Court of the United States, particularly its landmark ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. In that case, the Supreme Court established a new framework for evaluating firearm regulations under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Rather than using older legal tests that balanced public safety against gun rights, the court stated that modern gun laws must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Under this framework, when a law restricts conduct covered by the Second Amendment, the government must demonstrate that the restriction aligns with historical regulations that existed during the early years of the United States. In other words, courts must look to the historical record to determine whether similar regulations were accepted during the founding era or shortly thereafter. If the government cannot show a historical tradition supporting the restriction, the law may be considered unconstitutional. Applying that standard to the magazine ban, the judge examined whether limits on ammunition capacity had any strong historical precedent in American law. The court found that magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds are widely owned and have become standard components of many modern firearms. Millions of these magazines exist across the country, and they are commonly used by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes such as self-defense, recreational shooting, and firearms training. Because of their widespread ownership and common lawful use, the judge concluded that these magazines fall within the type of arms protected by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The government attempted to argue that the restriction was necessary for public safety, but the court emphasized that under the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin standard, policy arguments alone are not enough. Without clear historical examples of similar restrictions, the government's justification did not meet the constitutional test. As a result, the court determined that the magazine ban could not be upheld under the framework established by the Supreme Court of the United States. Following the lower court's ruling that struck down the magazine restriction, government officials quickly moved to challenge the decision through an emergency legal request directed to the Supreme Court of the United States. This type of request is known as an emergency stay. It asks the Supreme Court to temporarily pause the lower court's ruling while the broader legal fight continues through the appeals process. In practical terms, the government is asking the court to restore enforcement of the magazine ban while judges review the case in greater detail. Emergency applications like this are often filed when officials believe a court ruling could have immediate and significant consequences. Government attorneys argued that allowing the lower court decision to remain in place could create public safety concerns and legal uncertainty. Their argument is that once the ban is lifted, large-capacity magazines could once again be sold and distributed, which they believe may make it more difficult to enforce the law later if the ruling is eventually reversed. By requesting a stay, officials hope to preserve the status quo until higher courts can determine whether the lower court's constitutional analysis was correct. When the Supreme Court of the United States receives an emergency request like this, it is typically reviewed first by the justice responsible for that federal judicial circuit. That justice can either decide the request individually or refer it to the full court for consideration by all 9 justices. The court may request responses from the opposing side before making a decision, although sometimes emergency rulings can come very quickly. If the Supreme Court grants the emergency stay, the magazine ban would likely be reinstated temporarily while the case moves through the appeals courts. If the court denies the request, the lower court ruling blocking the ban would remain in effect during the ongoing legal battle. Either outcome would signal how seriously the court views the constitutional questions raised by the case and could influence how similar firearm challenges are handled in the future. Although the case began as a challenge to a specific state law, its potential impact reaches far beyond a single jurisdiction. Several states across the country have enacted similar restrictions limiting the size of firearm magazines that civilians can legally possess. Because these laws are structured in comparable ways, a major court decision striking down one of them could influence how courts evaluate the others. That is why legal experts, policymakers, and advocacy groups across the United States are watching this case closely. Magazine capacity limits currently exist in multiple states, including California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Washington. While the details vary slightly, these laws generally prohibit magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds of ammunition. Supporters argue that these restrictions are a reasonable safety measure designed to reduce the lethality of violent attacks. Critics, however, maintain that these limits restrict access to commonly owned firearm equipment and therefore conflict with constitutional protections. The importance of this case has grown significantly since the Supreme Court of the United States issued its decision in Moratorium. New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. That ruling introduced a history-based test for evaluating gun regulations under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, requiring courts to determine whether modern firearm laws are consistent with historical traditions of regulation in the United States. Because of this new legal standard, many previously accepted gun laws are now being challenged in federal courts. If courts continue applying the Bruin framework in the same way, similar magazine restrictions in other states could face increased legal scrutiny. A final ruling from the Supreme Court of the United States on the issue could establish a nationwide precedent, clarifying whether limits on magazine capacity are compatible with the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Such a decision would likely influence future legislation, ongoing lawsuits, and the broader national debate over firearm regulation and constitutional rights. With the emergency request now filed, the next step depends on how the Supreme Court of the United States decides to respond. The justices have several possible paths, and each option could significantly shape how this case moves forward. One of the first and most immediate decisions involves the government's request for an emergency stay, which would temporarily pause the lower court's ruling that struck down the magazine restriction. If the court decides to grant the stay, the challenged law would likely go back into effect while the legal process continues. This would not mean the court has ruled on the constitutionality of the magazine ban itself. Instead, it would simply preserve the law temporarily, while appellate courts examine the case in more detail. Courts sometimes grant stays when they believe there is a reasonable chance the government could ultimately succeed in defending the law, or when they want to prevent sudden legal changes while a case is still being reviewed. Another possibility is that the Supreme Court of the United States could deny the emergency request. If that happens, the lower court ruling striking down the ban would remain in effect while the case continues through the appeals process. That outcome could allow the sale and possession of the previously restricted magazines to resume, at least temporarily, depending on the exact terms of the lower court's decision. Beyond the immediate stay request, the justices also have the option to eventually hear the case in full. If the dispute reaches the court through a formal appeal, the justices could agree to review it and issue a final ruling on whether magazine capacity limits comply with the Constitutional Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. A full Supreme Court decision would carry nationwide authority and could clarify how lower courts should apply the legal framework established in Harcham, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association vs. Bruin, potentially shaping firearm regulation across the country for years to come. At this stage, the situation remains fluid, and the immediate focus is on how the Moorish Supreme Court of the United States responds to the emergency request filed by government officials. Emergency applications are designed to address situations where a court ruling could have immediate legal or practical consequences. Because of that, the Supreme Court often considers these requests on a much faster timeline than typical appeals, sometimes issuing decisions within days or even hours after receiving the filings and responses from both sides. If the court decides to grant the emergency stay, the previously struck-down magazine restriction would likely be reinstated for the time being. That would mean the law would once again be enforceable, while the broader legal challenge continues through the federal appeals process. In this scenario, the case would still move forward in lower courts, but the regulation would remain in place until a final ruling is eventually reached. If the justices deny the request, the lower court's decision blocking the law would remain active. That outcome would allow the ruling declaring the ban unconstitutional to continue in effect while the case is reviewed by higher appellate courts. Although this would not represent a final Supreme Court judgment on the law itself, it could still carry important signals about how the justices view the arguments being presented. Meanwhile, the legal battle would continue as both sides prepare additional filings and arguments. Depending on how the appellate courts rule, the case could eventually return to the Supreme Court of the United States for full review. If the justices later decide to hear the case on the merits, they could issue a definitive decision interpreting the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution and clarifying whether restrictions on magazine capacity are compatible with constitutional protections. Until that happens, the legal status of these laws may continue to shift as courts across the country interpret and apply the precedent established in TBO. New York State Rifle and Pistol Association vs. Bruin. This case is moving fast, and it could become the next major Second Amendment showdown at the Supreme Court. We'll continue tracking every development as this story unfolds. So if you want clear updates on major constitutional cases and breaking legal news, make sure you stay tuned. And let me know in the comments. Should magazine bans survive constitutional scrutiny or not?